everyone for coming. I am more than I can explain excited about being here. I do see some of my old favorites. This is called the History Sharing Program, and I want to stress that third word up there. It's the Gloucester History Sharing Program, and sharing is what is very important. I'm going to share what I know, but what makes this a much better program is if you share what you know. And some of you folks here know so much more than I do about Gloucester. My name is Beth Wellen, and before we start, I do need to thank two organizations that made the restarting of this program possible. The Phyllis A. Marine Association has adopted the program, so I'm now legally another nonprofit again. And major thank you to the Awesome Gloucester Foundation, which paid for my equipment so I can actually show. You can't show slides without the computer and the projector. So thanks to them, I now have this. What we're going to talk about today are the old hotels. Not every single one, the ones that I've been able to find information on. And let's get started. We're going to go from the southernmost part of Gloucester and work our way up the coast. And now that means we start in Magnolia. Okay, this is actually where I live, and this is my neighborhood. But it doesn't look like this anymore. Right up here is the Oceanside Hotel, and right here is the Hesperus. This is Lexington coming right down here. This is Fuller. This is Ocean, and of course there's a lot more buildings here than there are at the time of this map. This map says 1887, so that's what we're talking about. So let's look at some of these hotels that were in Magnolia. For those of you who don't know, Magnolia was a very upscale resort. People like Kennedy's, Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan are some of the people who used to come and stay in these places. Hesperus. This was on Hesperus Ave, in between Fuller and Lexington, if you know Magnolia at all. And it was built in 1877. It was opened by Mr. Daniel Fuller, hence the name Fuller Street. It was the first Magnolia Hotel, and it later got incorporated into the bigger Oceanside Hotel in 1913, and it was demolished in the 1950s. Okay, now this postcard, most of these images we're seeing are from old antique postcards. This is labeled the Magnolia Inn, and from the research that I was able to find, I think, that's why I have a question mark here, I think this is the old Perkins house, which got turned into an inn, and then that was in 1877, the same year the Hesperus opened up, and this was, but 2 years later, it was bought by Mr. George Upton, and he spent a year working on it, and he converted it and opened it up as the Oceanside Hotel, and I believe this is that original part that we just saw in the previous postcard. Now this is Lexington Ave going down here, and you see this little canopy that cars could drive under, and with time, the Oceanside grew and grew and grew. It was quite a large hotel. It was on the corner of Lexington and Hesperus. It had 600 rooms and plus 10 cottages. And if you remember, it also eventually bought and operated the Hesperus in addition. So basically all of Magnolia Point was Oceanside at one point. I found this layout. Now this is before a big addition. I think this is the original Perkins house, and then they added this. Now what this floor plan doesn't show is that it eventually went much further than what we see here. Let's take a peek at what it used to have. Because you remember that drive-through we saw? There we go, there. Here is an overview. You can see how big it did, and here's some of its cottages, its tennis courts, some more cottages. These two cottages are still there if you go down into Magnolia, although this one has been added to quite a bit. It's 3 times bigger now. Here's the Hesperus on the other side of Lexington. Here's another picture of it. Now, this building had, like I said, some very prominent guests. Rose Kennedy, J.P. Morgan, John Philip Sousa, Cecil Rhodes, General MacArthur, were just some of the guests that would stay in this hotel. Very high-level, prominent. Has anybody ever been to the Mount Washington up in New Hampshire? Same caliber. Very ritzy, very gorgeous. This building burnt down in 1958, and I hear stories in Magnolia about it burning down. Huge, huge fire. Now we're going to go to another hotel. Now this one looks very similar, and for a long time it confused me because it was called the New Magnolia Hotel, and it looks very similar to the Oceanside, but it's actually a separate building. This one was built in 1891, well over 10 years after the Oceanside had been up and going. It was nearby. It was on the corner of Lexington and Flume, and it burnt in 1908, so it actually didn't last very long, only about 15 years. Now we're going to head into Gloucester. This is the Magnolia Road. I'm thinking, since it's called the Magnolia Road, this is probably Magnolia Ave going down to 133, and at the very end of it, where it joins 133, some of you may recognize this little building. It's still there. This is Wellspring, right. But the original part is a very, very old house, one of the oldest houses here in Gloucester. And as you can see in this postcard, it was called the Stagecoach Inn at one point, but its history actually goes further back. This was the first home of the Freeman family. The Freemans were former black slaves. And since slaves didn't usually have last names, quite a few black slaves, when they were freed, were called Freemans. And so and there are pictures of the last Freemans that lived in this house. And now it's still serving good purpose, being Wellspring. Okay, now we're going to go down to the boulevard, because I want to talk about this corner right here. Now, who knows the name of the beach along here? Everybody? It's Pavilion. Does anybody know how it got that name? Because of this building, right? This is the very end of Pavilion Beach, and there used to be the Pavilion Hotel there. Now, this was built in 1849. But by 1896, it had been renamed to the Surfside Hotel, but the beach has always kept the name Pavilion because of the first hotel. And this is the very end of the boulevard here. Now, what's interesting, if you look here, you'll notice these buildings right along the water. It was in the 1920s, when we were getting ready to celebrate our tricentennial, that they built Stacy Boulevard, and they removed all the buildings that used to be right along the water there. And now it's that beautiful promenade. But these buildings were either torn down, a number of them were actually picked up and moved. Some of them are on Riggs Street. I love this building. Look at this beautiful features. But it did not, unfortunately, last. It did burn down in 1914. Here's a picture of it from the street side, and another. And when it burnt down, they did replace it with a new hotel called the Tavern. Now, if you look carefully, it's the same building that we know as the Tavern, but it has had a few additions. One thing you'll notice is this little balcony patio area here. That, early on in its history, was extended. Here it is again. You can see the patio that opened up to the back balconies, but here you see they actually extended the building and added more rooms. And here's a view from the water before they extended it, and now after they extended it. And what you see right down here this is all paved over now. If you go there for a function, it's all parking lot. But this was a swimming pool. I can imagine, during storms, it getting salty. Now, the Tavern was built in 1917 by a Mr. W.H. Smith, and It lasted until the 60s. Early, was it 60s or 70s that it closed down? About the 70s. Does anybody remember going and eating there? Because I know they had a restaurant. I'm sure quite a few of you actually remember the tavern when it was opened as a restaurant. Now this is another building you might recognize. Here it's whitewashed. At one point it had very fancy balconies on it. Loved the artwork. And it was whitewashed. This was at the time when it was called the Puritan House. You'll notice there's two distinct parts. This part is the oldest. Now we all kind of still call this Blackburn Tavern because of the restaurant many, many, many years ago. But this is this oldest part. It was originally the Mason House, which was built in 1810. This is the first hotel for Gloucester that we know of. And it is a survivor. It actually survived the 1830 fire that wiped out most of Lower Main Street. It actually kind of predates most of that area. The back part was added in the 1870s, enlarging it quite a bit. And it had many different names. Like I said, it was originally the Mason House. There was the Puritan House. In this picture, it's a little hard to read. It's called the Atlantic House. And you notice that the balconies aren't quite as fancy at the time, and it's also not whitewashed anymore. Some of its other names was the Tappan House, and of course Blackburn Tavern when it was the Blackburn Tavern restaurant. This is not Howard Blackburn's tavern, though. Howard Blackburn, our famous dory fisherman, ran a tavern. His Blackburn building is actually what we know as Halibut Point Restaurant. His name's right across the top. He didn't have this building. This is an ad from the late 1800s that I was able to find advertising the Atlantic House, and it says, within 2-minute walk to the beach. That, of course, being our Pavilion Beach. Here it is again. It's no longer a hotel, and I'm guessing from the cars, this is about the 1950s. Does that look about right to you guys? 1950s? 40s maybe? Okay. Does anybody remember there being bingo at that building?
Closer to the 40s, I think.
Okay, mostly in the 40s. And here's another picture, I think taken the exact same day, because the cars are still in the same spot. Now, if we would go up Main Street a little bit, you would have seen this building. Not necessarily a grand hotel, like some of the other ones that were more fancy, but this was right on Main Street. This is the old Belmont House, and that was near where Cape Ann Savings Bank. It was right near Porter Street. And here's another picture of it from the front, the Belmont House. And it had a dining room and clothing shops on the first floor. This was probably where a lot of the fishermen may have stayed overnight in between trips, and businessmen. Now, if you go up to the top of Main Street and up on the hill, this is Main Street here. This is Water Street. Water Street doesn't exist anymore. Water Street is the other half of Harbor Loop. Harbor Loop, this part of Harbor Loop right here used to go all the way up to Main Street, and that used to be called Water Street, and it was in the 1970s during urban renewal that Water Street going through the Walgreens parking lot was removed. And this would have been right there on the corner. How many people remember this as the Gloucester Hotel? It was the Hotel Savoy, and then it changed over and became the Gloucester House. Here we see the Gloucester Hotel sign, but you could still see the words Hotel Savoy on it. And I know when this picture was taken because of the VW bug. This is the 60s. How many people recognize what's next door? The A&P Market. Of course, that's all parking lot now. And so now you know exactly where this used to be. Now, my friend Ron Gilson told me that they used to have dances up there. Does anybody remember that? Concerts and dances in this building? Like a ballroom upstairs. Nobody went to that? No? If we go down well, it's actually almost across the street. Now, this is Main Street here. This is Elm Street. Right now, there's the green clothing store and Common Crow's sandwich shop is on the corner. This is where the Smith Hotel used to be, with their dining room down here on the first floor. And then on the very next corner, again, this is Elm, this is Main. This is where Cameron's is now, was the Elm House. Again, these were probably just more like boarding houses, opposed to fancy hotels like some of our others. But we had quite a few of these little hotels right here in the Main Street area.
The Army and Navy store for a while.
Army and Navy store used to be in here?
On Elm Street, right across from Water Street.
Okay, yep. And so the Savoy would have been right across the street. Okay, now we're going to leave Main Street area and go around East Main Street to Rocky Neck. This building is actually still here. It's now condos. It actually started as a family summer home that was called Rake Cliffs. And one of their sons-in-laws decided, oh, this is a nice fancy house. Let's make this into a hotel. And he turned it into the Rockaway Hotel. Now, I actually have a friend who used to work there. She remembers the Rockaway hotels. Anybody else here remember the Rockaway? Yep. It was in 1896 that it became a hotel. And here are some pictures, various postcards showing that from the grounds, and their view of the water. Yes, they did have still do have a wonderful access to the water down there. Although right now I know there's a swimming pool here. So, going down Eastern Point Road, there's a series of hotels, and they actually start to get fancier and fancier the further we go out. One of the first ones, it's actually a collection of buildings, a whole bunch of cottages, dining halls and stuff like that. This was the Harbor View. Now the Harbor View is at the foot of Patches Hill, and it was opened by W.P. Osborne. President Woodrow Wilson stayed here. It's, of course, now gone and subdivided into lots of nice houses with their wonderful water access. This is actually inside the lobby of that postcard I was able to find. Now, a little further down, on the water side was the Delphine, and Ron Gilson again told me stories of going and seeing some very famous people perform here. And nearby was the Merrill Hall. Now, for the longest time, I couldn't figure out what the Merrill Hall was, but then I found some advertisements from 1908 and 1914. This is the 1914 one that listed it, Merrill Hall, East Gloucester. This resort, known for its excellent cuisine, cool, airy rooms, fine beds, and comfortable surroundings, caters to the refined taste of those who appreciate these special features. So yes, it was definitely a summer place to stay for the refined. And what's fun is right underneath is an advertisement for one of our other big hotels that we'll be getting to soon, the Moreland. Very close to this is on the, not on the water side of the street, is the Fairview, and this is still there. I actually had to go take this picture myself because I had a hard time finding postcards for this. Fairview is actually very, very old. It was started in 1842. That predates a lot of the hotels that we're looking at today. It had a couple of very famous guests. Louisa May Alcott stayed here twice, in 2 different years, and Kipling stayed here. And this is where he was stayed when he was working on his book, Captains Courageous, about the Gloucester fishing schooners. Funny story I heard when researching that was that he went out on a trip and got majorly seasick, so decided he was going to stay land-based and talk to fishermen to get the information to write his story. And this is where he stayed. Now, this is what's there now. I can't tell if it's actually still running. It does have flyers on the bulletin board. This was a year ago when I went in and took the picture in October, but it was all boarded up for the season. I don't actually know if it's still operating, but I finally did find an old post. It is still operating?
It was last summer.
It was last summer. Yep.
That's just about across from the other big hotel on the other side of the street.
Hawthorne.
Pardon?
The Hawthorne?
Hawthorne.
Yes.
Inn. Well, right across the street, up a little hill. And before you came to the building that's there now, there was another building that burned down before that.
This part. Oops. There we go. I finally found a postcard. These two buildings are still there. But this piece is missing. And it looks like there's quite a few people on this porch enjoying themselves there. Across the street, on the water side, this whole point, this one's kind of fuzzy. This is the Hawthorne Inn, but this was a good postcard to show you how big the complex was. Again, multiple buildings, cottages, dining halls. It was a whole complex. This was opened in 1891 by George Stacy. Now, if Stacy sounds familiar, that's because this is the same man Stacy Boulevard is named after. And he was a hotel person, and he tried to build and develop things here in the city. Here's better pictures. Again, you can see quite a few buildings on this complex. This had a casino. It had vaudeville, it had a dancing hall, it accommodated 450 guests. In 1938, most of the buildings did burn down because of arson, but it was able to still keep running for a little while. And it actually stayed open past World War II for a little while, and then it finally gave up. It's now condos. And Arlie, you were telling me one of the buildings still exists? And it's a private home now. And more pictures of the inn and the cottages. Shuffleboard at the Hawthorne Inn. There's funny stories about Mr. Stacy, who ran this. Apparently wasn't as posh as some people expected for its reputation. And when they got there, like, hey, this isn't quite as fancy as we thought it would be. He goes, okay, you don't have to stay. I've got other people who want to come in. And he did. It was sold out every year. And there were people who were very possessive. This is their place. Don't change it. Even though some of the other hotels had better amenities, but this was very well liked. One of the roads through there, the Willows. Now, this was not an inn.